right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for Armchair Travel, Antarctica Travels at the End of the World. Antarctica is the coldest, windiest, driest place on Earth. 2/3 of all our planet's fresh water is locked up there in the form of ice in a continent twice the size of Australia. The last continent to be understood, it is a harsh and unforgiving environment that challenged and took the lives of many early explorers. Okay, that's okay. And let me keep going here. Although an ice sheet covers 99% of the land, the exposed areas along the coast nourish a wealth of tiny plants and sea creatures, which in turn support the world's greatest concentrations of wildlife in the sea, on the land, and in the air. The lecturer, Barry Pell, traveled by ship to Antarctica for 2 weeks. Based on his travels on the sea and excursions onto the land, he will discuss and show his photography of this most magnificent and unique continent. And a little bit more about Barry. Barry is a world traveler and photojournalist. He has traveled widely over 5 decades, visiting and documenting landscapes and cultures in nearly 170 countries on all continents. Barry has also lived and traveled in China, Eastern Europe, North Africa, and South America. He currently lectures on international cultures at schools, universities, libraries, and community groups in the Boston area. So all 60 of us so live here on Zoom, and I'm sure the hundreds that will watch the presentation after the fact. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Barry for joining us here this morning. And Barry, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring this program. Well, welcome everyone on this Saturday morning. And thank you so much for attending this photographic journey to the continent of Antarctica, entitled Travels at the End of the World. This is the last place on our planet to be discovered and mapped, which my wife and I visited a few years ago during the year that we were living and teaching English in Santiago, Chile. It seemed like we were in the neighborhood, so it seemed like a good opportunity to just head down to visit the Antarctic continent. Now, the journey that we made was by a number of different modes of transportation. We went by ship, by small motorcraft, and also we hiked quite a bit on the ice and snow. And that was an effort to bring us closer to the glaciers, the icebergs, the penguins, and the seals. And so in this program, what I'd like to do are a number of things. I want to discuss some history of the continent's early discovery and exploration, to show you some of its dramatic landscape, the amazing animals that not only survive, but thrive in this challenging environment. And for those of you who might be considering a voyage there, how we traveled. And finally, and very importantly, I will speak about the environmental changes that are taking place on the continent, based in part on information from research stations that are there that we visited, and how these changes due to climate change are thinning the continent's ice mass and also reducing the food supply on which the continent's life depends. And certainly afterwards, as Robert indicated, I welcome discussion, comments, and questions. So first, let's just take a look at at a map for a little bit of orientation. So we're looking here at the bottom of the planet, looking up at the continent of Antarctica. The crosshairs is the South Pole, and the continent has basically 2 lobes, if you will, East Antarctica and West Antarctica, and then very significantly has this sort of appendix piece that extends out into the Southern Ocean about 800 miles. And it is that area that most visitors to the continent travel on, because it is ice-free for part of the year, and it's easy to get on land and to explore. And many of the animal life, the birds, the penguins, the seals, are also congregated in this location. This area, though, also has been the subject of a lot of melting that is occurring because it is exposed within the warmer waters surrounding it of the Southern Ocean. It's also the closest place to get to by sea, because if you go in this direction up here, northwest, about 600 miles, you will come to the very tip of South America. And that's the easiest access point, the closest access point, and that's the one that we traveled from by sea. You can also get to Antarctica from New Zealand down in this direction. It's a little bit further, and that would get you to this part of the continent. And then if you head up in this direction, a much further distance, you'll come to Europe and Africa out over here. So that gives you a little bit of orientation. And so we can begin now with some of the amazing landscape. Okay, well, at the dawn of the 20th century, the British explorer, Ernest Shackleton, he placed an advertisement in local newspapers. And that advertisement read, and I quote, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, but honor and recognition in case of success." Well, since the time that Columbus set out for exploration beyond Europe, nearly all of our planet's land masses had been discovered and known, but the continent of Antarctica remained a mystery. For centuries, it was shown as an undefined mass at the bottom of the world. It was named Terra Australis, and it was believed that this vast South land was necessary to balance the northern continents of Europe and Asia to preserve the symmetry of the world's land masses so that the Earth wouldn't go spinning out into space. And so began, in the first decades of the 20th century, what is referred to as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, of the planet's last continent to be discovered and mapped. Well, the men drawn to this adventure, and yes, at that time it was all men, had to risk hunger and frostbite and death to compete to be the first explorers of this final terrestrial frontier. And in particular, their goal was to be the first to reach the ultimate prize, and that was to stand upon and plant their nation's flag at the South Pole. Well, it would not be easy. And three names during this age stand out among these earliest explorers, and their stories are truly larger than life. They are the stuff of legend, intrigue, and myth. Many of us are familiar with Ernest Shackleton. He reached within 100 miles of the pole, but he is remembered most for his ill-fated trans-Antarctic expedition when his ship, the Endurance, became trapped in pack ice that looked a little like this and was slowly crushed before the crew could reach land. Most of his crew had to camp out on the sea ice, although it started to disintegrate in the warmer weather, while Shackleton and a few of his mates raced for help over 700 miles in a small boat across a stormy ocean. He was ultimately successful and was able to return to save his crew. But the competition to reach the South Pole fell to two men, and their voyages occurred simultaneously. The British captain Robert Scott started out earlier, but his team was not as well equipped. They encountered severe conditions on the route that they chose, a lack of provisions, and freezing weather that ultimately led to the suicide of some members and the death of the remaining polar group, including Captain Scott. A memoir of Scott's expedition is, which I highly recommend for anyone who is interested in the story of human stamina and determination tested to its maximum capacity, is appropriately entitled The Worst Journey in the World. The first expedition to successfully reach the South Pole then occurred in December 1911, and it was led by the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen. And he was a famous explorer. He had done a lot of exploring in the polar regions, but for his trip to Antarctica, because it was such a dangerous voyage, he kept his mission a secret. And he told his financial supporters that he was headed in the opposite direction, in the better known area of the Arctic, to do some exploration there, because he knew that he'd hardly get financial backing if he told people he was headed to the treacherous South Pole. Even his crew were not told until they left their last port of call. Now, to Scott's bitter disappointment, we know that from the diaries we found next to his frozen body, Amundsen arrived at the South Pole 5 weeks ahead of Scott's team, and he was able to return safely to the base camp. And so he received the fame as being the first successful voyager to the South Pole. Now, if the North Polar region can be described as an ocean surrounded by continents up by the Arctic, then Antarctica is the reverse. It is a continent surrounded by oceans. Antarctica is indeed the coldest, windiest, and paradoxically, perhaps the driest place on Earth. Average precipitation is less than 5 inches, all falling as snow, which perpetuates a polar desert. Now, again, this may seem ironic given the widespread appearance of ice and snow, but the explanation is that what does fall there, the little that does fall in this desert, over tens of millions of years builds up and is pressed into ice. And the result is an ice sheet that covers some 99% of the continent, and in some places is more than 2 miles thick. In fact, 2/3 of all of our planet's fresh water is locked up in this ice on a continent that is twice the size of Australia. And the Earth's only other ice sheet with fresh water occurs in the northern hemisphere, covering most of the continent of the island of Greenland. And so under its own weight, the ice is constantly flowing downhill in slow-moving streams that eventually, at their forward edge, will break off and drop enormous icebergs into the sea. Now, Antarctica is also the world's highest continent, with more than half the land over 6,500 feet above sea level. And the ice on the highest peaks reaches nearly 15,000 feet. The continent also, unsurprisingly, has the most active glaciation in the world. Now, the harsh physical environment is plagued by what are known as katabatic winds. And these are enormous storms that spring up without warning and roar down the glacial valleys at up to 120 miles per hour. The wind chill effect can be numbingly serious. Now, the waters surrounding the Antarctica between about 50 and 60 degrees south latitude are affected by a combination, the meeting of the warm, salty currents coming from the north, from the tropics, meeting the cold, fresh water that moves north from the continent. And this is the key biological condition that has enabled life to survive on the continent. Because where these salty, warm, and fresh, cold waters meet, this is known as the Antarctic convergence. And their mixing provides a perfect environment for the massive production of organisms called plankton and tiny crustaceans called krill. And it is this food source that nourishes a wealth of tiny plants and sea creatures, shown here in this man's glove, which in turn is able to support the world's greatest concentrations of wildlife in the sea, on the land, and in the air. A little bit about our trip to Antarctica. Our journey began in South America's southernmost town, the Argentine port of Ushuaia. And as I mentioned, that is the closest place closest land point to then make a voyage by sea to the continent. Now, My preferred form of travel, and I have traveled widely over the past 5 decades, my preferred form of travel is to go independently and to use public transport. Of course, neither is an option for going to Antarctica. Nearly all visitors travel to the continent by ship. It's also possible to arrive from New Zealand, but the tip of South America is much closer. Now, tourism has expanded amazingly large since it began in the early 1960s. At that time, there were only about 60 people, 60 tourists who visited the continent per year. The number of tourists coming to the continent has expanded since then to over 50,000 during the 2018-2019 season. Now, with the growth in tourism, the former village, the embarkation point of Ushuaia in Argentina, has mushroomed, and I must say, as you look at this picture here, not very attractively, spreading out and up the pristine hillsides with every form in the town of sporting goods stores, hotels, restaurants. There's even a Hard Rock Cafe at this end of the world. Well, for tourists, Antarctica is accessible, of course, only during the austral summer season, which on the opposite side of our planet occurs from November to March. And during that time, the sea ice that surrounds the continent melts sufficiently to allow boat access. Coastal temperatures rise as high as the 50s Fahrenheit at times, and also, there are up to 24 hours of daylight, which was instrumental in allowing lots of photography. In contrast, during the winter, the sea is impassable. In fact, the area of Antarctica approximately doubles each winter because of the formation surrounding it of sea ice. Now, the ship that we took was this one. It was the MV Ushuaia, the same name as the town, by the way. And it was considerably smaller, about 275 feet in length, than some of the behemoth multi-level floating cities that some travel companies offer. In fact, our voyage wasn't even considered a cruise. It was considered an expedition run by this company called Antarctica that specializes in relatively small ship Antarctic voyages. Now, there are lots of advantages in going in a smaller ship. First of all, we were able to navigate better and closer into tiny bays and approach much closer to the land. The captain could more easily maneuver for close-up viewing of icebergs and sea animals. And perhaps most importantly, we had a capacity for under 100 passengers. Now, Antarctica has lots of regulations, environmental regulations, to avoid stressing the environment, stressing the animals. And one of them is that you can only land a maximum of 100 passengers at a time on the continent. We did get there by using these sturdy 10-passenger Zodiac outboard rubber boats. Now, if a ship has more than 100 passengers, they then need to send those passengers onto the land in shifts. And of course, naturally, that results in much less time being able to view the continent and to walk around on hikes itself. In addition, some of the largest cruise ships that may have 300 or 400 passengers are not even allowed to land at all, and they simply view the continent from shipside. Now, the passenger composition on our ship was nothing, as I imagined. The passengers ranged in age from 7 to 87. And for those of you who are thinking that you have to be in top physical shape to go on a trip like this, it is not so. The crew was very helpful in accommodating everyone at every age. There were also arriving, it was quite international, from 18 different countries. There were people on board who routinely take such voyages, and others for whom this was an opportunity that they had dreamed of and saved up for a lifetime. About a dozen of the passengers were American university students led by their penguin research professor. And during our 2-week trip, we got to know nearly all of the passengers. We had a complement of about 88 passengers. Now, what made our life on board so memorable was having a very helpful Chilean crew, from housekeeping to bartenders, and 6 Argentine expedition staff who were trained as scientists and biologists. And in the evenings, after our hikes, after dinner, they gave lectures on aspects of Antarctic geology and marine life. And in addition, warmly awakened us on the intercom each morning in English and Spanish with a "good morning, my dear passengers," and a description of the scheduled outings for the day. And here they are posing with us with our obligatory certificates for having visited the continent. There were 3 very ample meals served on board daily, including the occasional creative chocolate penguin top dessert. Well, the names of the waterways crossing from Argentina to Antarctica, and in fact, the designation of landforms, the mountains and valleys within the continent itself, form a who's who of the early discoverers and explorers of this remote and forbidding part of the world. So from Ushuaia, we first had to pass through a protected channel called the Beagle Channel. The Beagle Channel was named after Darwin's ship. This is a replica of that ship when he voyaged here in the 1830s. And then you go out into open water. And this is the most challenging and treacherous part of the access to the continent, crossing a 600-mile open body of water called the Drake Passage. It was named for the 16th century English explorer, Sir Francis Drake, and it is one of the most notorious places in the world for rough water. The crossing is referred to sometimes as the Furious 50s because of its latitude, or more colloquially as the Drake Shake. And certainly it lived up to its name. Now, our captain held our ship at the channel entrance for most of a day, waiting for a storm to pass so that we wouldn't have the worst crossing. And we had time built into our schedule to allow for that. The resulting crossing, with the aid of some seasickness pills generously dispensed by our ship doctor, was indeed manageable. Now, in the past decade, some tour companies have begun offering flights to Antarctica in order to bypass the Drake Passage. However, this is not always the most efficient way to get there because, again, environmental regulations on the continent mean that there can be no installation of lights or navigation aids that might interfere with the behavior of the animals who live there. And so you can only use visual flight instruction to get to the continent. And because weather is often quite overcast, cloudy, and foggy, this means that anyone scheduled to take a flight to Antarctica instead of going by ship could easily be delayed up to a week or more. Well, obviously we were all anxious, peering out at the bow to get our first glimpse of Antarctica and then step foot on it. But our initial encounters in our sea voyage was with the sea birds, including the Antarctic tern, shown here with its blood red bill and legs, and the kelp gull, which is the only seagull found in the Antarctic, which would soar around our ship in the strong air currents and dive into the water for food, mostly squid. But the most impressive bird that we were able to sight quite a bit was the wandering albatross. And this is the world's largest flying bird, incredibly impressive with its wingspan of nearly 12 feet. Indeed, albatrosses spend most of their lives in flight, gliding the waves and circling the major wind systems. They are famous in the South Ocean on the way to Antarctica. Albatrosses are truly legendary birds, partly because of their great size, but also because they inhabit such remote and storm-ridden seas. Now, early 17th century mariners respected their grace and majesty in flight. They generally disapproved of killing them, and they also believed that the souls of drowned sailors were reincarnated in albatrosses, and that increased their fear that killing them would bring bad luck. Indeed, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a lyrical ballad by the English poet Samuel Coleridge, underscores this legend of a ship whose crew was doomed after one of its sailors shoots an albatross that had guided them safely through the icy waters. Well, as we got closer to the continent, we also began to see lots of whales, these enormous mammals with lengths over 50 feet in pods of a few to more than a dozen. Now, there are 7 whale species that are commonly seen on the continent, and we spotted among them the Antarctic minke, fin, and sei species. The largest number we saw, though, were the humpbacks. Of course, this is a species we're quite familiar with in New England, but we were mesmerized by their behavior as they came close to our ship and gracefully cut through the ocean at speeds of 15 miles an hour or more, blowing their air in bushy puffs as they surfaced to take a breath, as well as when they raised and splashed their tail flukes and then dove back underwater. Occasionally, these large animals would breach the surface where most or all of their body would leave the water. Now, the most striking feature of the humpback is its extraordinarily long pectoral chest flippers, some 16 feet in length, and both the flippers and the tail have white or nearly white undersides. And this unique pigmentation pattern and irregularly scalloped shape at the edges, as shown here, is sort of like the animal's fingerprint, and it's unique to each whale and makes it possible for biologists to catalog each and every individual whale. Now, humpbacks are untoothed whales. They feed by filtering the small plankton organisms that I mentioned previously through a series of mouth plates of tough material called baleen, which hang from the position normally occupied by the upper teeth. And as a result, with an open mouth, they plow through uncountable concentrations of the plankton and krill that are so prevalent in this area of the Antarctic convergence. And they then expel great quantities of water and press their large tongue against the roof of the mouth and swallow their catch. Now, one thing that's different about the humpback whales in Antarctica from those in New England is biologists have observed a form of catching their food that has developed only in these waters, something called bubble feeding, where the whale will create a circle of disruption, maybe 30 feet in diameter, which then confuse the organisms and fish in the area. The whale will be in the center below the water and then will rise up in an explosive open mouth movement to then engulf their prey. Now, our ship constantly, of course, kept a lookout for us to bring us as close as possible to these whales. And an intercom announcement by the staff that whales had been spotted brought us scrambling to the deck, cameras in hand, whether it was the middle of dinner or the middle of the night, for that matter. Now, there were 4 a.m. sunrises and late crimson red sunsets that filled the dome-like sky during the summertime that we were there. And so we had, fortunately, over 18 hours of daylight for watching and photographing. Now, we then got closer to the continent and we started to approach some pack ice and ice flows nearer to Antarctica, and we began to see populations of hourglass dolphins that would race through the water, accompanying us just ahead of the ship's bow. We also saw the very distinctive dolphin that we were excited to see, the orca, with its strikingly jet black body above and brilliant white below. Now, orcas are the largest dolphin. They travel with great speed in a close-knit group, and they're also known as killer whales, but there are no records of them attacking scientists or tourists. But they are indeed, these orcas, predators of penguins, seals, fish, and on occasion other whales. I'll speak about that more in a moment. And so finally, after 2 days at sea, we arrived at Antarctica. And as I mentioned in the introduction, tourist ships visit the coastal areas that are essentially ice-free. And we are there during their summer months to enable landing. And so our cruising area was along the small islands, the bays and inlets, which form that appendix that I showed you, the 800-mile-long arm of the continent in West Antarctica, known as the Antarctic Peninsula. Now, of course, we had an itinerary that was intended for the various ports we would stop at, various places we'd stop at. When traveling in Antarctica at any time of year, even the relatively ice-free summer, it's important that there be flexibility, because we occasionally encountered ice that was simply too thick and dangerous for our ship to navigate. And the captain then had the latitude to adjust our route and landing locations accordingly. And so we then started a 10-day course of a routine. And that daily routine consisted of going out in these Zodiac rafts of 10 to 12 passengers each morning and afternoon for walks and hikes of 3 to 4 hours each. And during that time, we might be walking along some of the snow and ice. It was somewhat crusty, not too deep. We were able to manage pretty well. A walking stick, always helpful. Occasionally, though, we were faced with bigger challenges. Not everyone went up the steepest mountains. This climb up this mountainside, I mentioned Antarctica is the most mountainous continent. This climb up the hillside took us about 2 or 3 hours to get to the top with some incredible vantage points. But of course, coming down was a lot easier, usually using a different part of our anatomy to make that return trip. Now, and what we were doing there, of course, is we were also at times walking along some of the volcanic ridges. Now, there were also some parts of our landings that were somewhat ice and snow free, because the Antarctica also was characterized by a fair bit of volcanic activity below ground. And so some of the land is still quite warm enough to prevent the buildup of snow and ice. And all of our activity there, besides seeing the grandeur of the landscape, was intended to encounter several species of penguin and seal colonies. And if there are no dividers, no fences, there are no separations between we human visitors and the animals, who have the free run wherever they want to go. But again, we were instructed, in order to protect this environment, to make sure that we always yielded the right of way to the animals whenever our paths might cross. Now, visiting regulations, as I say, are quite strict in order to protect the Antarctic environment, the animals, and ourselves. We had some regulation outfits. We were issued high rubber boots, waterproof pants, and life vests. And the life vests are all numbered. The numbers are checked when we leave the ship to go into the Zodiac rafts, and they're checked again when we returned on a list to make sure that no one was inadvertently left on the continent. We also had to walk through 2 disinfectant baths with scrub brushes on each side to prevent carrying any non-endemic microbes onto the continent. And the procedure was repeated when we returned to the ship. Now, between our hikes on the continent, our time on board was also quite full, filled with breathtaking views of the passing behemoth icebergs set against a backdrop of the mountainous landscape of Antarctica. Now, I had previously traveled in the Northern Hemisphere to Greenland, where I also observed large icebergs there. But the ones in Antarctica I felt were truly mountains of freshwater ice that have broken off glaciers or the ice shelf and were now floating freely in the open water. These enormous blocks of ice are then immediately, they start off in kind of a geometric fashion as they break off and split away from the ice sheet, but then they are sculpted by wind and water erosion. They start melting in the sunshine, and each iceberg then is sculpted by nature in a unique and magical way. And here is one that looked curiously a little bit like an airplane. Well, from a distance, a row of flat-topped and peaked icebergs resembled, to me, a little bit the skyline of a small New England town with their salt box houses. Now, as the center of gravity of these melting bergs shift with erosion, they then begin to turn over, to topple over and rotate 90 degrees, sometimes 180 degrees, which of course makes a thunderous roar in the process. Now, our ship captain, again, wanted to get us as close to these icebergs as possible, but was always cognizant of the fact that when you see an iceberg above the waterline, fully 4/5 of the berg is also below and spread out under the waterline and not easily seen. And so we had to be careful to avoid any Titanic type collisions. Now, occasionally we would also pass an iceberg lying low in the water, or an ice floe of drifting ice where one or more penguins or sometimes seals had hauled themselves out of the water in order to rest during their 4 or 5 hour fishing excursions in the water when they're capturing fish for their young. Now, in addition to our land explorations, where we got out of the Zodiac rafts and walked around, we also made trips staying in the Zodiac in order to get closer to remote cliff hillsides. And on those outings, we were able to observe nesting cormorants like these, snow white sheathbills, one of my favorite birds in Antarctica, and also the multicolored lichen and moss-covered rocks, as well as to approach some towering glaciers looming ominously above our small craft and looking the world as if at any moment they may come crashing down upon us. Sometimes a spotted seal would pop its head up, curious as to whether humans or perhaps a tasty penguin was on board our boat. If we felt a little bit vulnerable in these small rafts, we were then able to look behind us at our mothership framed by icy peaks, looking majestic and certainly a reassuring haven in the immensity of the Antarctic continent. Well, we also on these outings passed the decaying remnants of whaling ships and canoes and communications towers. These have been left behind and are evidence of the presence of humans who have been coming to the continent during the past 100 years. Now, as you know, there are no permanent towns or villages in Antarctica, only research stations. But from its earliest days and before it was protected as it is today, the continents and its waters were plundered for its natural resources, chiefly seals and whales. And from time to time, we would encounter the bleached bones of enormous whale skeletons like this one. Well, all this is very well and good, but frankly, the main reason that people come to Antarctica and the highlight of our trip were to see the animals, particularly the penguins, and the opportunity on the continent to observe close up these cuddly animals and their countless busy activities, which they seem to be constantly in motion, assembling their stone nests like this one, going out on their fishing expeditions by waddling skillfully, if perhaps not so gracefully, on their webbed feet up and down steep hillsides, and going out on their fishing expeditions, waiting at the edge of the land for just the right moment when the water would come in to dive in and fish and then return to their nesting colony with their gullets full of fish to feed their young. The places where they live were usually at a very airy, high point on the hillside. and they would then, this is called a rookery, and they would then be able to rejoin their babies in order to feed them from their gullets into the baby's mouth. Well, penguins and other wildlife, for that matter, in Antarctica, are protected from human interference. And as a result, they have essentially become habituated. They're accustomed very much to humans visiting their land and getting as close as 3 to 4 feet. We were told to maintain a distance of at least 10 feet, but sometimes the penguins didn't know that regulation, and they would be as curious as we were about them, and they would come right up to our feet in order to kind of check out who the current batch of humans were who were on their home turf. In fact, they seem quite oblivious in most cases to our presence, going about their important business with the confidence that we humans would stay out of their way. Now, penguins have been around for millions of years. Contrary to popular belief, only 6 of the known 17 species of penguins are found in Antarctica. Now, although they are birds that are flightless in air, they have been designed by nature superbly for their task of fishing. They have compact, streamlined bodies, short, wedge-shaped tails, and webbed feet and massive paddle muscles that make them superbly designed both to grab onto rock on their way to the water and especially to swim underwater. Now, their stiff feathers also are provided to deal with the very cold conditions they encounter. And the feathers create an insulating layer of air, sort of a bubble, a separation over a thick layer of their blubber and skin. Their heads can also retract when they are swimming to give them more hydrodynamic shape. Effectively, their bodies are packed in blubber with a kind of windproof outer parka. Now, despite average winter temperatures, which can fall as low as minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit, penguins, again, have been adapted to nature because they can stand for hours on freezing cold rock because they're able to adjust their blood flow to keep their feet just a few degrees above freezing. And so we spent lots of time simply observing, staying in one place, and looking at the very busy activities of these penguins as they progressed by jumping from rock to rock, by tobogganing over ice and snow. Some have their rookery homes high up on steep cliff faces, and they had to work their way up and down to those rookeries. Others are able to leap like salmon when they are out on the water to land on ice floes. Now, on land, they have a kind of an ungainly rolling gait as they waddle back and forth, but in the water, that is their element, and they can travel very fast by careening just at the surface or diving in pursuit of squid, shrimp, or fish. Now, the penguins move from the waterside to their hillside rookeries by traveling on these paths, which are known as penguin highways, known, of course, to we humans, not to the penguins. And they have formed them, and they use them over and over again by tamping them down with their webbed feet. We were cautioned, of course, never to walk within the penguin highways, but to establish our own walking paths, never to interfere with theirs. Now, penguins are, as you might have seen in pictures of millions of them congregated together, penguins are highly sociable birds, both at sea and ashore. They breed in colonies that can involve hundreds of thousands of mating pairs. The most common penguin in Antarctica, which is estimated to be at least 8 million, is known as the chinstrap penguin. And it's so named because of the black line that you see here on its chin, the black line that crosses its chin. Now, there's another species that is called the gentoo penguin, shown here. Both of these species make their nest not underground, as some penguin species do, but instead from a nest of small stones, that is a mounded saucer of these stones. And the penguins, both the male and female pair, will take turns carrying these tiny stones from an area that may be a few hundred feet away. And it is a tireless job, tirelessly exhausting, it seems, job where they mound these stones and can only carry one by one in their beak. They also then, of course, because they put in so much work to build their nesting stone pile, they protect it quite vociferously. And one thing about penguins is some are opportunistic, and when one penguin is away capturing or gathering another stone, another penguin may try to come in and steal some stones for its own nest, which of course provokes a very raucous confrontation. Well, this nest building process, which keeps them so occupied, stone by stone, seemed so frustratingly slow that my wife actually felt she wanted to grab a pile of stones and help them out. Of course, our guide discouraged us from interfering with nature in that fashion. Now, penguins have a clutch of 2 eggs annually, usually between late November and late December. And both parents, again, share in the incubation period, which is about 5 weeks. The chicks, as I have mentioned, are fattened at birth from regurgitated krill that each parent takes turns capturing on their sea excursions. Now, one consideration in deciding when to visit Antarctica, during the summer, of course, is the birth of the penguin chicks. And we traveled in the middle of January, shortly after the birth of many of the chicks, when to our eyes, they were at their most adorable size. At about 2 months old, they begin to shed their fluffy down. Of course, while they are in the period of having this fluffy down, they cannot be in the water. It is not waterproof, and that's why their parents must fish on their behalf. And here you can see in this picture, part of their feathers, their birth fur is falling off, and they're beginning to show their waterproof protective skin that will then ultimately be their entire body and enable them to go fishing on their own. Now, as adults, they grow to slightly taller than 2 feet. Well, despite the natural adaptation that penguins have to the harsh weather in the continent, the lifespan of penguins here is only about 20 years. And in addition, of course, they are the subject of predators, many different kinds of predators, both on the land and in the water. When they're in the water searching for food, penguins are prey to leopard seals like this, and also, as I mentioned before, orcas. On land, there are brown skua-bergs like this that use their powerful jaws to carry off penguin eggs, swoop down to swallow small penguin chicks, and drag away larger ones. And their penguins are always on the lookout, again, being a communal group, always on the lookout for these nasty skua birds after the penguins. And they would sometimes rest on their at the rookeries on a high vantage point, looking for an opportunity to attack the penguins, which would result in them making noisy shrieking sounds to defend their nests when the skuas were nearby. Now, the other animal that we saw lots of were different species of seals. And the seals live essentially within the same terrain and environment as the penguins. In contrast to the penguins, however, who seem to be constantly busy with nest building or fishing or caring for their young, the seals, relatively speaking, seemed quite indolent, I would say. They have a somewhat unattractive torpedo-shaped body and move like penguins very tenuously on the land, but again, their bodies are designed like penguins for fast underwater travel. Now, there are 6 seal species living in Antarctica, including the Weddell seal, shown here with its smiling small face. And like many seals, the Weddell seal will use its strong flippers, does not have feet. It'll use its strong flippers to climb out of the water onto the ice floes and push forward on its stomach. Now, the elephant seal, shown here, is Antarctica's largest, also the world's largest seal. The males can weigh over 4 tons, fit into a 15-foot length. And in establishing their territory, they will produce a ferocious roar, can be heard for quite a distance, aided by the resonating chamber of their elephantine-sized nose. Now, when we were in our zodiac rafts, which are secure but somewhat a little bit flimsy, certainly not as secure as being in our ship, we would be very comfortable, the guide would be, if inquisitive seals would nuzzle up to the raft when we were exploring the inlets and the glaciers. But the guides became much more cautious, a little bit nervous, when a leopard seal like this would come snooping around, because these seals, called leopard seals because of their spotted coat, have a reputation for violence and aggressiveness, and they've attacked people and have actually been known to pierce and upset inflatable boats like ours. Well, let me tell you a little bit about some of the human activity on the continent. There are about 30 countries that maintain some 70 permanent research stations that are constructed on rock and ice scattered around Antarctica. The total human population ranges. In the summertime, it rises to about 4,000 staff seasonally. In the winter, there's usually only about 1,000 permanent staff. And these staff, by the way, if you're going to spend a cold, dark winter on Antarctica, there's lots of psychological testing that you have to be given before you are accepted to live there year-round. Now, we stopped to visit a few of the British and Argentine stations. Their residents certainly were enthusiastic about the unique opportunity to live with penguins as their immediate neighbors, but the staff also seemed, I must say, delighted to have a break with some human visitors as well. By the way, the first woman in Antarctica was a Danish-Norwegian explorer who arrived in 1935, but nowadays women comprise the staff at nearly all of the Antarctic stations. In fact, some of the research stations have all-women scientific crews. Now, politically, no country owns Antarctica. The activities, there are lots of laws that govern activities there, environmental protection. There's something called the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, part of the Antarctic Treaty System, which has established the continent as a zone of peace and science. It's currently signed by some 54 countries. There are protocols on environmental protection, procedures and obligations of each country in protecting the environment and its ecosystems. The protocol also applies to tourism, and at the beginning of our cruise, we were made aware of the protocol and instructed about the rules for the protection of wildlife, the respect for protected areas. Now, in international law, Antarctica is designated as something called a condominium. And that means that many countries who are party to the agreement have agreed to equally share sovereignty and exercise rights jointly, and that they have not divided the land into national zones. Nevertheless, we learned that some of the treaty countries, such as Chile and Argentina, the map of Chile is shown here, have also reserved the right to make a future territorial claim. And as you see, Chile has extended their international borders and carved out a little wedge-shaped piece, which includes the Antarctic Peninsula over here, have carved out a little wedge-shaped piece, which they then can exercise a future claim of sovereignty. Altogether, certainly politically, it is a very complicated situation. Well, also complicated and controversial is the issue of the impact of global warming on Antarctica's landscape and wildlife. There's been lots of research, maybe because of proximity to the countries doing the research. There's been lots of research on the Arctic and how global warming is affecting the Arctic in the Northern Hemisphere. But climate change impacts in Antarctica have been comparatively neglected or reported misleadingly. In general, the science is clear that climate change is already negatively affecting the ice and the life of the animals there. But it varies considerably depending on where you are. The continent is enormous, and so some places in the center of the continent, the large landmass of the West Antarctica and East Antarctica, they have not been showing much melting. In fact, some of them are showing lower temperatures. But it is on the Antarctic Peninsula, in the western part of the continent, that has exhibited some of the fastest warming places on the planet. The mean air temperature on the peninsula has increased by over 5 degrees Fahrenheit in the past 15 years. And this has affected the thinning of the ice in particular, and the loss of ice mass. Nearly 90% of the glaciers along the West coast of the Antarctic have retreated in the last 50 years, and this retreat is accelerating. You can see here in this map places where, shown in red, where a lot of melting is occurring, whereas places in blue, there is actually more freezing going on. So it's a very uneven effect of global warming. Now, in 2017, scientists reported the breakup of something called the Larsen Ice Sheet, which is along the east side of the Antarctic Peninsula. It was a floating sheet of ice the size of Delaware that broke free from this side of the peninsula. And that it occurred is certainly, of course, beyond dispute. That it's the result of global warming is beyond dispute. But what remains unclear is whether this is a forecast of things to come, or perhaps just some localized warming of the peninsula region alone. Indeed, there are marine fossils, mainly shells of animals without backbones, and finds of fossil leaves, in fact, and wood that have been discovered, and they show that in earlier geologic periods, the climate on Antarctica was, in fact, much warmer. Antarctica once contained extensive forests, and even research has shown contained dinosaurs that roamed across the continent's surface nearly up to the South Pole. These are an example of some of those fossils that have been discovered. The problem with trying to predict the future in Antarctica specifically is that, first of all, there is just not enough data available yet on which to base the predictions. And secondly, the way things work climate-wise is not fully understood. It is apparent that temperature increases, though, and melting ice has affected the flora and fauna, particularly on the Antarctic Peninsula. Antarctica has only 2 flowering plant species, and they have now spread considerably to newly available land where ice has melted. Certain penguin species that depend on the ice for most of the year have abandoned their nesting sites, and the krill that they depend on for survival has dropped as significantly, with stocks a mere 1/5 of what they were 30 years ago. Now, on one of the surprisingly warm January afternoons during our trip, we returned from a morning excursion to encounter the paradoxical scene of a barbecue in Antarctica being prepared on the outside deck of our ship. Later, many of the passengers participated even in a brief ocean dip. A chilly experience, to be sure, but rewarded with major bragging rights to having swum in Antarctica's Southern Ocean. Well, a visit to Antarctica leaves an indelible impression, I think, of the beauty, the strength, the power, and the energy of the continent, but also makes you aware of the fragility and vulnerability of its land. Moreover, I think the experience of viewing penguins and seals and other wildlife in glorious abundance within their own natural environment is so innately different than even the best designed environmentally correct zoo landscapes. There is, it seems to me, a sense of freedom, lacking a better word, a sense of authority that these animals impart in their behaviors and interactions, which, even given the predators which are part of their ecosystem community, make their actions appear more uninhibited and genuine. And I certainly feel privileged to have had the chance to visit their world. Thank you very much.